So my friend George here reached out recently. I wanted to talk a little bit about Reinhardt and some of the things that I've kind of gone through in my journey. And he asked for a lesson, and I was like, I don't know about a lesson, but I'll certainly like meet up with you. We can talk. I don't really think of myself as much of a teacher anymore, as much as I am just sharing kind of the things that I am learning and discovering and stuff like that. And I'm always happy to geek out and talk trumpet. And George was kind enough to let me record it so that if there was anything useful or worthwhile that might benefit others, that we could share it. But I think, George, you wanted kind of specifically to talk about some of the Reinhardt things and some of like what I kind of first got into when I first learned about that. So I'll turn it over to you to ask. So
absolutely. So I've got actually a bunch of questions here. So
perfect.
I'm really interested. Yeah, I'm really interested in your transition from your old setup to your new chops setup. And so for like the first question I would have is, did you find that you tired more quickly when you kind of, especially when you shifted lower? You know, you said you have more, less of the upper lip in the cup when you shifted, right? So did you become tired more quickly? And if so, how long do you think it took you to adjust?
Yeah, so this is kind of more specifically when I switched over to being like a type 4, because it's all changed a little bit now with doing all the TCE stuff. But I would say that I found as moving, letting so I think naturally I was a type 4 kind of all along, but then through well-meaning instructors and also just some of my own lack of knowledge and looking at other players, I started changing my mouthpiece position, you know, because I would look at someone like Wayne Bergeron, for example, or Bobby Shue, or just any number of players, and I would see that they set it higher. And so I would go, oh, well, that must be the secret.
The right way.
And so I'd start trying to set it higher, and it just wouldn't, I could never, or I'd read like the Claude Gordon books where he advocated 2/3 on top. And I could just never, it just seemed like that those always never seemed to work. So when I switched back to playing my more natural way as a type 4, where the air is going upstream and bringing the mouthpiece down, which is probably a combination of like the shape of my teeth and my lips and stuff like that is what's kind of causing that. What I discovered, or what I found, is that it's not necessarily that I would tire sooner. I would tire sooner if I tried to play with the same amount of volume of air and energy as I was accustomed to when I had more lip in the mouthpiece. So if I would if I would try to like blow that hard and like kind of muscle my way through it the way I did before, then I would tire more quickly. But if I would just sort of relax and allow just the natural efficiency of having less top lip in the cup and how it's more easily excitable, and not just try to, I think my biggest problem, especially when I was in college and like I was a soloist for marching band and lead trumpet for the big band, and then also principal for the orchestra. Like and I think marching band more than any of it, I would just try to play so loud. And that's the thing that I think that's hard to do as a type 4 player, is to play loud. You can play with a sound that's penetrating. You can play with a sound that projects. You can play, like, especially in a recording a situation, or even like playing in a big band in a hall, it's loud enough for that. But when you're standing on an open football field and you're trying to just play loud, as a type 4, it's in my experience, it was very difficult to keep that from allowing me to, from basically what ends up happening. It's not so much that I get tired, it's that this swells up and it stops working. So, so that was kind of my experience with it. So I had to learn to kind of back off and just not play dang loud all the time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that may lead me to another question. And so I want to keep that in mind.
Well, and let me just kind of add to that too. So I've taken several lessons with Roger Ingram, and I think it was maybe the second or third lesson I took with Roger, and we were going through stuff, and he said, "Hey, come sit down beside me, and let's just play through some things together." And so I'm just playing. And at the end of it, he says, "I got to tell you, man," he's like, "if I hired you for a gig and you came down and sat down next to me and you played that loud, I probably wouldn't say anything, but I would never hire you again. And I was shocked because I was not trying to I was not trying to overplay Roger Ingram. That was not what I was trying to do. But I was just ignorant, and I had, grown up in a lot of these Oklahoma band programs where you're not really getting instruction in balance in your jazz ensembles, but in the wind ensemble balance, you're being taught to balance like a pyramid. So the lower voices should be louder, and the higher voices softer. And so I was like, well, I'm playing below you, so I should be louder, not recognizing that in a big band you'll bury the lead player doing that, and the big band's voice the other way around. It's like that. So. And so that also was helpful. So I think in general, I just had a habit of playing just far too loud all the time anyway, which just exacerbated the problems I had as playing as a type 4.
That's okay. Well, let me ask this then. Did you find, you're talking about backing off, and obviously you're talking about backing off from the volume of air, I guess, coming through, right? Mm-hmm. But did you also find that by changing the embouchure, and maybe even more so, I heard you mention, I think you're exploring TCE now. Mm-hmm. Are you also backing off from lip pressure? Like, I'm the kind of player who just jams it right in there.
Yeah. I think as a type 4, I think everything has to be lightened up if you're playing with a low set, because there's just not much meat or muscle underneath there. Yeah. And because of that, it's all like very excitable. So, a little bit of air, a little bit of flexion, like kind of goes a long way to change it. But you can overdo it really quick. So you have to just kind of like ease up on it quite a bit. So yeah, I did also find that I wasn't having to just like, kind of grip down as hard through that. And I just want to be really clear. I wouldn't encourage people to like try to be a type 4. This Reinhardt's whole thing is kind of like you are what you are. There's a small, very, very, very small group of people that could go either way, that can easily just put the mouthpiece anywhere and figure out how to make it work. But most of us, because of the way all this stuff is set up, like not just like the size of our teeth, the size of our top teeth compared to our bottom teeth, how they're shaped, if there's gaps, like how the front of the tooth is shaped, like your lip, there's just all these factors. And so just kind of play the way, put it on your face in the way that feels natural, and then go from there is kind of his methodology, which is to me one of the biggest eye-opening things about that.
So this is something I'm kind of discovering for myself, and I'm curious if this is an experience you have or had. Do you find yourself shifting your jaw like forward to access higher registers? I mean, is that, I'm finding that if I do that, all of a sudden I can play with almost no pressure and these high notes just kind of sing.
Yeah, I think that's, that I definitely have noticed that, especially when things are working well, then I notice it for sure that happens. I think something that may be happening with that is that it's creating a slightly better seal between the bottom lip. And it's not that you want your lips like sealed, like we need them to open for air to come through and for the oscillations to happen. But I think there's something about that when that jaw comes forward, it's like pushing that bottom lip in, and you get to this point where you get like a nice, efficient, optimum seal. And it changes. And as you, I think most people would know this, but we'll just cover it real quick in case people don't. If we're playing, essentially, if we're playing loud notes, our aperture will be larger. If we're playing quiet notes, they'll be smaller. Again, on average, if we're playing low notes, the aperture will be larger. If we're playing high notes, the aperture will be smaller. A mezzo piano middle C, that size aperture and airspeed, if you kept all that the same and then went up to the high C, that would come out as probably a forte or fortissimo with that big of an aperture. Yeah. You would probably need more airspeed to get like more flow to kind of fill that gap, but it would come out even louder with that size. So there is some small amount of adjustment there. So I think that's kind of worth kind of keeping in mind too, in terms of how it works. But yeah, I do find that like moving the jaw forward definitely helps.
I mean, for me, the feeling is almost a falsetto. It's like almost slipping into a different voice type, you know,
That's an
when you're
interesting way to
singing
think
it.
about it. Yeah. Yeah. Are you, but saying that, like, are you feeling like the tone? Because what you don't want, and you'll
Well,
hear this
yeah,
sometimes, and I won't name any players, but you'll hear this sometimes where someone will have like a nice, nice full trumpet sound, and then as they get into the upper register, and not even like the squeaky register, like if you're getting into triple
right.
C's and stuff, I get that that's going to be squeaky, but they'll get up to like even like just an F over high C or a G over high C, and it starts to sound like just like kind of, it sounds very small.
Yeah.
And there's times you
Well,
want that. If you're going to play the piccolo trumpet, you want that. You don't
right.
want to play the piccolo trumpet like Conrad Gazzo, like you want. But if you're trying to play commercial trumpet or lead trumpet, you want it as you ascend. That sound just stays. You kind of want your sound to be
Yeah.
like this.
Right. Yeah. And I think
Okay.
I think you've hit the issue. So I played around with Stevens Costello method for a while with the holding the trumpet and, just letting the
Yeah.
squeaks come out. And so it's
Yeah.
kind of like that. And one reason I kind of gave up on the Costello method was I could never kind of bridge that gap between kind of the normal playing and then kind of getting those high notes. And, they'd always sound kind of thin and just not quite there. And I
Yeah.
couldn't find a way of really smoothly going between. It's as if there's two different voice types, right? So it is like a falsetto.
Yep.
So I could never quite get there.
Yeah.
Well, I'll probably continue playing with it, but yes, you're right. It's that thinner sound. It's not necessarily a great sound, but I'm thinking it might become a better sound. I don't know if I'm fooling myself, but
In my experience, I think that there's a small amount of truth to the, like, today's squeak can be tomorrow's note. There's a small amount of truth to that. But essentially, because of what I was saying earlier, if you're getting a high note and it's a squeak, that just, all that means is that our aperture is like very, very, very small. And so if we could open that aperture a little bit more and increase the airflow, then it would become louder. That's really just how that works. So if you're doing something to create that, you ought to be able to get that squeak to become a fuller note within a reasonable amount of time. It's a mixture of strength and a knack. And so it won't take years to make that squeak a note. So if it's that, then you're just on the wrong track. It could take days, minutes, maybe weeks, but like if anything longer than that, I think like something's not quite right.
Well, I think I've basically been playing with this for maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, and I do feel like things are opening up a little bit up there, and it's like, oh, well, that's interesting. So
yeah, this has promise. Let me look into this. Yeah.
I'll play with it some more and see what happens. But I was curious what your take on that was. And honestly, I love playing fourth chair in the jazz band. We have a music band. And man, I mean, you get all the good flugelhorn solos, and there's a lot of
That's true. Yeah.
Chair. So I'm okay playing. I don't have to be a lead player. It's just not in my makeup at this point. I mean, I'd love to. That would be fantastic. But it's not. But I think one thing I really am interested in improving is endurance. So, and I think for a lot of that's probably just keeping the horn on my face and building those muscles and that sort of thing. But,
I don't know about that. I think there's some amount of that. I think there is some amount of just like, the just some playing and getting the repetition in. But I think if one knows like, well, I'm putting in a reasonable amount of practice time, like, that should not be as big of a problem. So I know for me, the things have been, I think you have to figure out if you are having endurance issues, you have to, and I love, George, that you're experimenting, because I think that's where a lot of people go wrong, is that they don't experiment. They just think, if I just do what I'm doing and just do it longer and harder and more of it, I'll get better. And the trumpet just doesn't really work that way. The trumpet is more of a knack, more of like, well, you got to do it just like this, than it is about like power. which is really odd, because I think we often feel. I remember again, another shout out to ITG, but I remember walking to this may have been the same ITG banquet that changed my life. Now I think about it, but I was walking to that banquet and just happened to be walking next to Marvin Stamm. And because that's just one of the beautiful things about ITG. And we were talking a little bit about it, and he was saying that we were talking about playing the trumpet, and he said, the thing about the trumpet is, like, when you watch people play and the way that you think it's going to feel when you play, and you just kind of, like, you watch Maynard or whatever, you just think it's like, oh, it's a weightlifting thing, it's a strength. And he's like, but it's just, it really isn't. And I remember, like, kind of the rest of that walk, just like thinking about that, like, well, he's right. I'm definitely thinking of it as like a kind of thing, and it just isn't that. So I think it's more of a knack, and it's like figuring out that combination, figuring out that those variables that make all those things work. There is something to be said for the physicality of it, and I definitely have noticed as I've in the last couple of months, as I've switched over to playing the wedge mouthpiece. I feel like that's helped my endurance quite a bit. And I think it's just simply because with the shoulders of the mouthpiece kind of moving away from the sides, I'm able to get better blood flow. And that blood flow keeps one of the issues I would have with extended playing is that the mouthpiece is on my face and it's just over time pushing the blood flow out, and then the tissue becomes less responsive. And so I've found that the wedge helps with that. Yeah. And then it can cause it to swell. So right. That's exactly right.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the first things when I came back to playing 4 years ago, I thought, well, I'll try this wedge mouthpiece and see and it didn't. I enjoyed it for a while, and I thought, oh well, maybe it's got possibilities. And then I set it aside, and I thought, well, that isn't quite working the way I want, but I may go back and check it out again.
It's not a fix all for everything, but if everything else is kind of working right, it's a noticeable difference. Like I can notice, like, okay, I can feel that and I can also see that I get the chance to play with some very fine players, but I can see that they're taking their horns off their face and taking a rest when we're playing the same part faster than I do, and whereas we used to be more even, we would each kind of have to be at the same spot of spelling each other. And now I can just kind of keep going. So cool. They may still be a better player than I am on other things, just to be clear, in case any of my friends watch this. I don't want to take it that way. I get to play with some really fine players that in many respects are better than I am on a lot of things. So.
I found when I watched your video from a year ago or whenever it was, and just the other day, and I found that when I started playing with some of those ideas, and like you, I had my band instructor was a great trumpet player, and he gave lessons to everybody in the school, very small school in upstate New York. And, but I remember he was the guy who told me, okay, we're going to get you a nice horn. You're a great player, but we need to get your centered, get the mouthpiece centered. You're playing too low on so I did all of that. And for years I just thought, well, that's the way it's supposed to be. I've got to figure this out. But, when I did this, when I shifted down and when I started kind of moving the mouthpiece, I found immediately, wow, I can do these lip slurs like between G and C, just gangbusters.
Yes.
So I'm assuming that was sort of your discovery as well. Yeah.
Yep. I could go right back to doing what I used to be able to do. And exactly right. Things just started working again for me at that point.
Yeah. Would you recommend any particular sort of, if you're doing any kind of embouchure change, I suppose, is it sort of the old exercises of lip slurs, long tones, that sort of thing to kind of help you establish that new feel?
Yeah, I think I like Clark studies probably slower than, what you could do normally. So if you're normally like something like that, go slow. It doesn't have to be slow, but like, just you're not trying to work on your fingers at that point. You're just trying to work out an embouchure. I think anytime I've done that stuff, I'd go back to like those early irons, lip slurs, just like, because the Arbin's book progresses too quick, I think, on lip slurs. Like it's very slow for a long time, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, yeah. Like it's just, there's not enough middle ground there. And so I had, like, whether it's the Bylin book or the Lowell Little's Embouchure Builder is a really good book. Irons, I would just go back to some of that simple stuff to try to work it through. And I think what a lot of people do, and myself included, I mean, I'm guilty of this too, but when you're working on something different or new, and the minute you start to feel like it has some promise, you're like, well, let's see if this embouchure has a double C in it. Like, you know, you just try to immediately like, this feels pretty good. How high can I play with it? Like, and maybe like, that's okay. I think as long as you're not like pressing or doing bad habits, it's okay to kind of geek around with that. But I was just read something the other day that I think is kind of worthwhile, that if you're doing, you want to focus more when you're trying to make these tweaks and changes. First of all, probably none of the tweaks or changes are actually as extreme as they feel to you. You know, they feel to you like you're just doing something completely different, but any observer would look at you and say, it looks the same. I think you're doing the exact same thing, and they really can't tell. But I think too many times when we make a change, we immediately want to see, well, like, can I play higher, faster, longer now after this small change? And what I think is actually better is to like, am I making this change properly without worrying immediately about the results? Now, a caveat on that is like, I'm just talking about like immediately. So like if you're working with a teacher and they're trying to get you to make a shift, like if someone was doing the tongue controlled embouchure or whatever thing you're doing, tongue level, doesn't really matter. It's more important to focus, like, am I doing it right? And not, well, do I like the sound at the end of the bell? That being said, I think in my experience, when I do it right, in a relatively short amount of time, I start seeing significant improvements. And that short amount of time is generally measured in minutes or hours of practice. It may not be the same day, to be clear, but it's measured in minutes or hours. And I should see promise within, honestly, in my experience, it's 1 or 2 practice sessions. I'll see something. And if I'm not seeing anything, or it's still really, really bad, I'm probably not quite doing something right. Like, and so I need to keep experimenting and trying.
Cool. I think this is probably my last question, and then I'd love if you have any further advice. I mean, you've given tons, and so that's really helpful. But do you kind of go, if you're making a change like this, do you go all in? In other words, is it like, I'm going to do this setup and I'm going to play with this setup and it's always going to be this way? Or is that sort of, I'm going to experiment with this setup and I'm going to practice with this setup, but when I go to play a gig, I'm going to use my old setup, you know, the thing that I know works?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Reinhardt talks about that in the encyclopedia, and a lot of other teachers comment on it, that, you know, and a lot of Reinhardt students would share this, that like when you're in the lesson studio, you're doing Reinhardt there, but when you're on the gig, you're just playing the gig and playing music. I envy those guys. I can't do that. I tend to be like, if I'm doing Reinhardt, then I'm doing Reinhardt everywhere I go, because my brain just tends to obsess on this stuff, which you can probably kind of tell from the channel, because like I'm examining things all the time to try to figure out how it works. And so if I'm on the gig, if things are going great, like I don't really worry much about it. But the reality is I'm pretty much always thinking about what I'm doing mechanically on the trumpet. And I would say that I also think of myself more as maybe a tactician on the trumpet. I feel like I'm a musical player. I play with a good sound. I play with good musicality, but I'm not necessarily a creative player. So I can improvise and I can do that stuff, but I'm not a great improviser. So if I'm playing with the Missouri Jazz Orchestra, you know, I'm usually playing, I often play the second book, mainly just for the range, because the lead player in that group is one of the best players in the state. He's phenomenal. When he's out, I have to sub for him. But when there's solos, there's usually 1 or 2 other guys that are just better soloists than I am. And so you got to put your aces in your places, and I'm the section leader. So I pass the chart to whoever I think is best. And if there's sometimes where I feel like, I got this one, like this one I can do. But there's other times I hand it off. So I think I'm not as creative as a musician or trumpet player. I'm a little more analytical, tactical. Like I'm more interested in how did this thing work? I'm amazed by the creative types and the folks who do that. I look at them like, wow, that's amazing. So when I'm on a gig, I wouldn't advocate this, but when I'm on a gig, my brain is processing what's going on in my chops. And Now, if I'm trying something very, very new, like when I first started switching over to the tongue controlled embouchure stuff, you know, well, that's not true. When the date I was working on a musical that was coming up, and I just started playing around with that, and it clicked, and I took that on that gig for that musical and used it for that. Wow. But there was some amount of experimenting on that musical of like trying to figure it out. So yeah, I'm probably the type that if I think I can get it out and use it, I'm going to do it. And then probably at moments during the gig, if I start getting tired or it doesn't work, then I end up going back to whatever I was doing before. Sure. But I'm going to probably try to work it up a little bit and then go see if this thing will work. And I don't know that I would advocate that necessarily, but it's what I do. Got it. And I, also I don't play for a living. Like I own music stores for a living and do that. And I do a variety of, I would consider myself probably a semi-pro player. I have a variety of some things that pay and some things that don't. And so I can take chances with it. If I was, trying to make my playing as a professional symphonic player or playing on Broadway or in the studios in Los Angeles or London or whatever, I might be a little more, careful about trying things out. But I'm just a serious amateur player just playing for the love of it. And so I can be a little more blasé about, trying new embouchures on a gig.
Sure. Oh, I got it. I have one last question. So, okay. And this is just a curiosity. Lower lip rolled out or rolled in, or depends on the situation?
Oh, that's a great, George, that's a great question. So for me, I've always felt like I've struggled with that bottom lip kind of rolling over my bottom teeth, and it helps to get me have like a nice sound. But I feel like over time, I've had a hard time getting that seal that we talked about earlier, which then makes me need to use a little more pressure, and not like an extreme amount of pressure, but just enough that causes issues, causes swelling, causes where I can feel the indentions of my teeth on my lips, and in extended playing situations causes some bruising. Like I've had that issue like since college, where I could take the horn off and my lips would be purple, and they'd be sore and purple. And I think for me, it's one of the things that I've found the most intriguing about TCE is because that tongue is up there against that lip. And it may be because I think I have like a taller top teeth and shorter bottom teeth, or I don't know, somehow how the way that works, but this wants to fold over, and it makes it hard, I think, to get it a nice loud sound in the upper register. And I need it kind of out there a little more. So I tend to think of it being there and then trying to maybe letting the tongue kind of pushing that down a little bit to create that hole to make it louder, only when I need it to be louder. So I feel like that's the half of what I've been trying to figure out in my playing for the last 25 years. Cool. Hey, yeah, you're welcome. Sure. Yeah, I think we're all trying to figure this thing out, and I just encourage you and anyone else who might watch this, like, just the experimentation is important. That being said, like, if you're playing great and you're happy with your playing, don't experiment. Just leave it and like just go make music and have fun. But if you're like me, where you're like, but I'm not able to do the things that I want to be able to do, like, don't just think, well, I just need to, like, it's not just working harder and putting more effort in. There's some amount, if something's not working, now that works to some degree on things like if you want to get really good at triple tonguing, there's just some amount of like, you're just going to have to put a lot of hours of practice in on that. Like it's just developing that. But if you're trying to figure out, like, I want to be able to play, the first trumpet part for wind ensemble or in a musical or in big band, and I'm having a hard time having the endurance or the range, that's probably a thing that you'll need to like discover and experiment to try to figure out. So don't be afraid to experiment, for sure. And take notes, keep notes of what you're doing and what seems to have promise and what doesn't. Well, hey, George, thanks for reaching out and for making this happen. Like, I think this was a lot of fun and a really interesting conversation. And if you're good with it, I'm going to share it, because I think there's some really good info there that would be worth sharing. So